This is a fun thing for me in a way because I used to teach, I used to lecture in archaeology at the University of Glasgow, and there was always a class that sort of I had to talk about Govan quite a bit and the Isle of Bute because there's been some excavations there, but you never really get a chance to kind of really dig into everything in between these places where there's been lots of excavations. So this was a good exercise for me as well to kind of dredge up some old slides and see how I think about them now, a few years later. So thanks for the invitation. Uh, so yeah, the thing about Old Kilpatrick is that it should be a lot more well known. I think it has been a lot more important than people think. But as Florence was saying before, yeah, most of the time, if you know about Old Kilpatrick outside of the area, you're probably thinking about the Antonine Wall and the Romans and yeah, the shipyards, as you mentioned. But there's a lot of other things that we can talk about there as well. So let's get into it then. This is just a quick timeline, just to kind of situate everybody in the time period that I'm most interested in. It's called the early medieval period, but the Middle Ages will do. The Dark Ages will do if you like that kind of thing. Some people say we shouldn't say the Dark Ages anymore because it demeans them, and we actually know quite a bit about them. But a brand is a brand, so I don't mind. It's the time period between the Romans and the Kingdom of Scotland proper under David the First, and the nations of England, Scotland, and Ireland all kind of take shape by about the 12th century. It's that period in between that I really like the most. So if you think about it this way, you can kind of break it up into bits. So there's the Romans and the Iron Age before that, but of course. The Antonine Wall is only occupied for so many decades in the second century, and then thereafter, Roman contact in this area is kind of intermittent. And so, it's the Romans and the Iron Age, and that's characterized by hill forts and crannogs in the Clyde and other kinds of things. The early medieval period proper starts in around the 5th century. The Roman armies have left Britain at this point. There's still people speaking Latin. There's still bits of Roman culture roundabout, but the Anglo-Saxons are invading in England, and Gaels are maybe coming in from the west, and all that is going on. But you also have the Age of Saints. This is when we have the earliest origin of Christianity in Scotland. And then finally at Dumbarton Rock, underneath where the castle would stand later, there's the hill fort of Alt Clut, which was the big power center in the area. So it doesn't get more important than that. At Old Kilpatrick and Dumbarton, you really are standing at the center of the kingdom of the Britons. And they're one of the big players alongside the Picts, the Scots of Dalriada, and the Anglo-Saxons of Northumbria for the south. And then something really important happens. The Viking Age, Vikings start raiding in the area, and in particular, Dumbarton Rock itself is besieged. And at that point, we don't hear about the kings of Alt Clut anymore. We don't hear about this power center on Dumbarton Rock anymore. We hear this new word, Strathclyde. And the first mention of the word Strathclyde is 872. So it seems something has really changed. First, for hundreds of years, you only hear about the kingdom of Alt Clut, the kingdom of Dumbarton Rock of the Britons. And then afterwards, you get this kingdom based on the Clyde specifically. And so something big has changed. And by the 10th century, that kingdom of Strathclyde is more often called Cumbria. And that's interesting because Strathclyde is maybe a Gaelic word, the Strath, the river valley. But Cumbria is this British word, very similar to Cymru, the Kingdom of Wales. And that's important because by the 10th century, the British kingdom is kind of in revival, and people are now promoting that old Welsh language, the old British language that had been sort of nibbled away at by other incoming languages. Now people are sort of proud to speak British again. And so the kingdom is called Cumbria, basically, same as Wales. And they're seeing themselves as this sort of pan-British allegiance of brethren between us here in the north and our cousins in Wales and in Cornwall, and so they're signaling that by calling the kingdom more Cumbria than Strathclyde. But you also have Vikings and you have Norse speakers in the area, the Gaul Gael, who I'll tell you about later. And then finally, in the 12th century, everything changes. Glasgow Cathedral is built. The Diocese of Glasgow kind of takes over. Parishes and parish churches start to be built, and you get the beginnings of the world of Scotland proper as we know it. A single kingdom in the center, based around the Forth and Tay, but expanding out to what we now call Scotland. So I'm interested in that bit in the middle. So with that out of the way, let's go straight to what's interesting. Let's go straight to the evidence then for what's happening at Old Kilpatrick specifically. And the key evidence is two bits of carved stone. This one that you're looking at here is a drawing of a cross shaft. It's broken at the top and at the bottom. But we have enough of this stone remaining so that we can tell exactly what it's supposed to be. You can see how it kind of tapers off from the bottom to the top. And you can see at the very top that there's two sort of curved, like circular, a change to that border so that it becomes circular. So we know what that is. That's actually a cross shaft. So that has been a stone cross. It's just the head has been broken off and the bottom has been broken off, and it's probably been reused as a building stone. What do we know about this? It was found in 1886 while digging a grave, it seems. But it says here, not digging a grave specifically, but when the Auchentorley tomb was opened. All right, so it was a lair that was already set out, and then that stone had probably been used to build that, and it was only recognized for what it was at the end of the 19th century. Okay, and another stone was found at the same time. This one in particular is in storage at Glasgow museums. I've never seen it. I don't know if any of you have, but if not, it's something that maybe we could call them about. Okay, so that was found in the churchyard. Okay, and it was on display. Well, it was set up there on view until it was moved to the Glasgow Museum for safekeeping. Okay, it's not the only thing important about Old Kilpatrick. So this one was found near Old Kilpatrick, but I think the assumption is that this one has also come from the churchyard. It was found reused as a footbridge. That's why we only have decoration on three faces and absolutely none on the top, on what would have been the upper face. It's completely been smoothed over. But again, I've not seen this one myself, so it'd be good to kind of see what this looks like in real life. The other thing to note about this one is that it's tall. It's almost 3 meters tall, and if this was like the other one, a cross with a crosshead that's been lopped off, then it would have been even taller still. So we don't know just how much taller this would have been before it was knocked down and damaged. Okay, so it was found over a burn to the east of the village now, and then it was erected in Mount Blow House in the 18th century. But eventually, the property was sold off, and at that point, it was given to Glasgow museums, where, like the other one, it remains in storage. So again, no surprise if you've not seen these or even seen drawings of them. They're available online, but if you haven't heard about them, don't feel bad. I don't think too many people have. Why are these two things important? We'll get to the kind of context of what these things are and what they mean, but they are early medieval. That means they are 1,000 years old, maybe more. I think these stones kind of date to the 9th, the 10th, maybe the 11th century. So at least 1,000, if not more, years old, these things. And they fit into a big pattern of freestanding crosses very similar to this, with that same kind of interlaced ornament, sometimes with human and animal figures, but more often just sort of geometric designs carved in relief. They would have dotted the landscape. They would have marked the landscape off as a world that was protected by the church, protected by God and the saints, and that's very typical of Scotland at that time. But this kind of design of these crosses is very specific to this area around the Clyde, as we'll go. But the other thing is the name itself, Old Kilpatrick. I'll show you where this one was found. That last cross, the Mount Blow cross, was found approximately here. There's the burn, as I said, just outside the east of town, and it was found approximately here. Give or take. Give or take a few meters. And it was found, I think, when they were sort of building that road through the place. But this gives you a little sense of context, okay? So the Clyde, obviously very important throughout prehistory and history here, but also the remains of the Antonine Wall. So Old Kilpatrick, as you well know, stands more or less at one end of the Antonine Wall. And I think the fact that there's these crosses here shows that this remains an important place after the Romans left. There were still people living here. It was still an important place to move through the landscape, probably a good landing place there on the Clyde as well, and just a good place whether you're traveling by foot or by boat. Okay, and so that's really interesting. And the fact that there's not one but two of these from Old Kilpatrick also sets it aside. There's only some of these crosses which come from churches, and here there's two. The name, as I mentioned, is also very important. Old Kilpatrick to set it apart from New Kilpatrick, of course, but Kilpatrick, that name in particular, probably itself goes back to the early medieval period. Okay, Patrick is, of course, Saint Patrick, most strongly associated with Ireland, but he was by birth and origin from Britain, and was born thinking he was a Roman, basically. He was a Latin speaker. He's probably bilingual in Latin and British, almost certainly. But he says his father was a deacon. And so, he comes from a kind of lingering Roman administration there at the beginning of the 5th century. And there's some debate as to where he was born. He says that his birthplace was called Banavum Taburnii, so he calls it by his Latin name. But later Irish sources say that he's from a place called Nemthor. And Nemthor is a Celtic language word, a Celtic language name. Okay, and in the Irish material, St. Patrick is seen as actually coming from Strathclyde. It says very specifically that he was born in a place called Nemthor, which is in Strathclyde. So that tells us two things. First of all, whoever's writing that down is writing it down after 872, when you have that word Strathclyde. So at least from the 9th century, people in Ireland, in Patrick's monastery there at Armagh, believe that he was born in the Firth Clyde area, in the Strathclyde area. And so the tradition that Kilpatrick was born here is not provable, but we know he comes from Britain, and we know that he has some connections later on with Dumbarton Rock. So even if he wasn't born here, he probably knows about this area, has some connection with this area in his lifetime. Okay, so let's go back then to what we know about early Christianity, because that's the best evidence we have for early medieval settlement, for the early medieval period in this area. So let's stick with the church for a minute. I said that St. Patrick has some links with the Clyde. I know that this will be obvious to many of you, if not all of you, but it's good to sort of lay it out just in case. St. Patrick himself, we know, is a historical figure. We don't know exactly when he was born or where he was born, but we know a lot about him. And we also have two things that he wrote himself in his own words. One of them is his confession. Confessio. It's sort of an open letter to the bishops of Britain. And then we also have the Epistola, the letter, an open letter in this case, to a king called Coroticus. And he is said to be the king of Alt Clut. So I think it's almost certain, although it's not above debate. Probably can never be proven strictly. I think it's highly likely that Coroticus, this king that he is writing this letter to, is the king of Dumbarton Rock, Alt Clut itself. Okay. And so he says lots of different things. He's basically admonishing them because the king there, Coroticus, says he's a Christian, but he is in Ireland slave raiding. And he's taking other Christians and making them into slaves and selling them on and so on. And so St. Patrick says, you're a bad Christian for doing this. He says, he writes to them saying, you're my fellow citizens of the Holy Romans, he says, he calls them. So he's trying to appeal to him in a language that he might understand and maybe guilt him a little for sort of saying he's a Christian, but not acting like a Christian. So that tells us a lot. First of all, it tells us that there is a king already by the early 5th century, and they are powerful enough that they can go as far as Ireland and go slave raiding and bring them back. And that's one of the sort of means by which this economy was supported. Okay, but there's also been excavations there at Dumbarton Rock. You can see maybe the ramparts. You can just about see the ramparts on the peak of Dumbarton Rock on the right there, the east side of it. The ramparts there have been proven to be a hill fort that was indeed occupied in the early medieval period, and amongst other things that they found were imported wine amphora, big jugs of wine that is coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, places like Turkey and the Aegean. This is something that you do see in Wales and in Ireland to a lesser extent, in places like Tintagel in Cornwall, another hill fort. Kings in the 5th and 6th centuries are indeed keeping in touch with the Roman Empire, or what remained of it, in the Eastern Mediterranean. And it looks like the Roman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean is looking for friends in a world that is rapidly de-Romanizing and de-Christianizing. I mentioned the Anglo-Saxons in England. And so they're looking for to keep people sweet. And the Britons and the Welsh, who are importing this kind of wine, are trying to act more Roman-like. They're also trading this stuff to their friends, and they're saying, look at the expensive goods that we can bring in here. And they probably have great big feasts where they let people drink their strange tasting imported wine. These were beer drinkers and mead drinkers, and so for them to drink wine is a kind of a showy thing to do. Okay, and so we know that from the excavations that there is occupation there from about the 5th and 6th and 7th centuries. And so we put all this together, and I think it's very plausible that Patrick is in touch with these people, and it is indeed Coroticus of Dumbarton Rock that he is writing to. Okay, and that means that Christianity has reached this area. We don't know how. Patrick doesn't say anything about missionary work or if there's a bishop who caters to these people, but we know that there's Christians. We also know that probably they're not the kind of Christians that Patrick would like them to be. Okay, so that tells us a lot. In the following centuries, we hear a lot of things like this. So Gildas in the 6th century is the first Briton other than St. Patrick to leave his own words. And he tells a story about the ruination of Britain. Okay, so this is a big angry sermon, but he is writing somewhere probably in what's now modern day Wales. He's a Latin speaker. He's very literate. And he's writing in Latin at this point. And he's talking about other British kings. And he says something very similar to what Patrick says, that there are kings that call themselves Christians, but they're very bad Christians. So he's kind of admonishing these people. So you don't have to read this whole thing. He's just in this passage. And I have to thank Thomas Clancy for pointing me to this passage, by the way. He says that people, instead of being drawn into the priesthood, they spend money to attain, they buy into the priesthood. There they remain in the same old, unhappy slime of intolerable sin, even after they've become bishops. They don't sit in it, but they wallow there disgracefully like pigs. So basically, he's saying, yes, there's Christians, but there's people who call themselves bishops, but they act like, well, not very Christian. And you can only imagine what that means, basically. Not modest, probably drinking a lot of imported wine and all the rest of it. So what Patrick saw in the 5th century also continues in the 6th century. But because we only have Gildas's angry sermon about it, we kind of get a one-sided view. And Bede, now in the Anglo-Saxon world, copies copies Gildas. He follows Gildas in a lot of his historical work. And so he continues this idea. And Bede is very negative on the Britons. This island as present contains 5 nations, he says. So he describes the world as it was in the 8th century. There's English speakers, British speakers, Scots, that's the Gaelic language, Pictish speakers, and people who speak Latin, okay? By the study of the scriptures has become common to all the rest. So he's laying it out. These are the 5 languages spoken in Britain right now. And then he singles out the Britons later on many times to say how bad they are at being Christians. To the Britons themselves, he says, to this day, inveterate and stumbling from their paths, they celebrate Christ's festivals without the fellowship of Christ's church. So again, he's following Gildas a lot in his historical work, but in his time, the kingdom of Northumbria, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, was busy fighting the kingdom of the Britons amongst everybody else. They were struggling for power, they were competing, they were rivals. And so this is probably the origin of this sort of animosity. And so these texts give us quite a one-sided view. All we know is that there are Christians in the Firth of Clyde area from as early as almost anywhere else in the British and the Latin-speaking world in the early medieval period, and I think that's an important point. And finally, what do we know about St. Patrick? So this is very much a historical issue. I follow historians at the University of Glasgow, like Thomas Owen Clancy, who I mentioned already, Simon Taylor, great place name scholar, and they assure me that Old Kilpatrick genuinely preserves an early medieval dedication, a cult of St. Patrick. Okay, so Thomas Clancy has written an article about the cult of St. Patrick in Scotland, and he confirms that that association between Patrick's birthplace and the Firth of Clyde does indeed go back at least to the 9th century, if not earlier. And he says Nemthor has never been sort of satisfactorily identified, but there is the use of that first element, the Nemed. It just means sort of sacred place or sacred enclosure. And there's other uses of that in the area, like in the place name Rosneath, which is the sort of peninsula of the Nemeton. And so it's not proof, but it's sort of ammunition for those who want to argue that Nemthor and maybe Patrick's birthplace is indeed in the Firth of Clyde. Certainly, there's a cult of St. Patrick. He's being celebrated there from the 9th century, and Old Kilpatrick would seem to be the obvious place for a famous shrine to St. Patrick, maybe even relics and reliquaries and who knows what else, festivals, feast days, and all the rest of it. And so that is genuinely early medieval. And the place name Kilpatrick is the Irish term for church. Killa, again, it means enclosure originally, but it comes to mean church. There's lots of Kill place names, and they might be early medieval as well. We don't know when Gaelic starts to replace the British language, but it certainly begins to encroach into this area in the early medieval period and becomes dominant by the end of the early medieval period. So that's all very interesting. But you can see all the other dedications to St. Patrick here in Thomas Clancy's map. So you can see that the Britons and Cumbrian Strathclyde more widely certainly were very heavily devoted to St. Patrick. So, and Old Kilpatrick seems to be one of the first places where his cult was celebrated. Okay, and I mentioned as well that there are Christians in the Firth of Clyde. There's also Christians in the Lothians and in what we now call Galloway, all across southern Scotland, in between the Roman walls, in between what used to be Antonine Wall and Hadrian's Wall. There's a series of Latin inscribed stones, just like this one. These have been dated by Catherine Forsyth, also the University of Glasgow. They've been dated to as early as the 5th century in some cases, and this one seems to be the first one, as far as we can date them. This one from Whithorn, which is associated with another famous saint, Saint Ninian. It's very clearly a Christian stone. This Latin inscription says, "We praise you, Lord." Latinus is the man being commemorated here. Age 35 and his daughter of 5 years raised this sign, probably is what that means. Okay, he's the descendant of a person called Barruadi. So there's another interesting thing. His family name is a Celtic name, maybe Irish, maybe British, but Barruadi is very much a Celtic language name. But his name is Latinus. You can't get more Christian, more Latin than the name Latinus, you know? And putting up a stone like this is very similar to how Christian Romans were putting up gravestones and other memorials in the 4th and indeed the 5th century here and abroad. So it tells us that the Britons of Galloway were certainly still speaking still speaking Latin, but probably almost certainly bilingual with the Celtic language. Okay, so there's Christians there, literate Christians. This is the map that Catherine Forsyth has put together. Not all of these are these Latin stones, but you can see the legend there below. This group here in the Scottish border area, and one in the location of what's now Edinburgh Airport, the Cat Stain. And then you've got 2 from Whithorn and 3 from nearby in the Rins on Kirkmadreen. Okay, so there's this cluster basically in between the walls, but they sort of go with other stones on the Isle of Man, Ireland, and in northern Britain, northern England. So they fit into a pattern. This is the earliest evidence for Christianity. But I think using stones and writing in Latin is also a way of saying we are powerful, like the Roman Empire was. We are the inheritors of that power, of that former Roman Empire. And that's why it's only in between these areas where there had been the most Romans wandering around before that the Britons take this on. The majority of these Latin stones are actually in Wales at the moment. And so they are very much as important as the Welsh language becomes in these areas in coming centuries. In the 5th and 6th centuries, speaking Latin was also a way of getting ahead. Okay, but you'll notice on this map as well, there's a great big gap in the west of Scotland. There's none of these stones from Ayrshire, none from anywhere along Strathclyde, where we know from St. Patrick's letter that there are Christians and they are in touch with the Roman Empire. They're drinking wine occasionally, at least at Dumbarton, you know, and so what's missing, what's going on with that? And that, I think there's probably just more stones yet to be found, but it is an interesting question to ponder. There's Christians here, but they're sort of acting in a different way. But I don't think we need to doubt that the west of Scotland is part of this wider world. Again, we've got that archaeological evidence from Dumbarton Rock, but excavations at Govan by my friend Stephen Driscoll. Once again, the University of Glasgow pattern emerging there. Stephen Driscoll did some excavations in Govan in the 1990s and continues to do so to this day. If you search for Govan in the news, you'll see they found a whole new bit of sculpture just this very summer. So all exciting things going on there. But Steve found what looks like the foundations of a very early church at Govan in those 1996 excavations. And underneath the stones of that early church, he found some burials. And one of them, underneath the walls of that church, was radiocarbon dated to the 5th, 6th, or 7th century. Okay, so we know that there are people being buried in that Christian fashion, probably around the same time as people are drinking wine at Dumbarton Rock. So the Firth of Clyde, we can just assume, is part of that continuing Roman world, has Christians, probably has Latin speakers, all the rest of it. Okay, and it's not alone. Excavations at Inchmarnock have very similar radiocarbon dates for early churches, perhaps. Early burials there in Ayrshire that have been found so far. And Glasgow Cathedral has early medieval burials, not quite as early as Govan. So Govan seems to be the primary sort of early Christian site in the sort of urban area of Glasgow as it is now. So if you've not been to the Govan Stones, please do go. They're amazing. And so there you go. So the Latin stones are the evidence that we have, the first evidence we have for Christians. The stones that we have at Old Kilpatrick are very different from these, as you'll obviously be able to recognize. Okay, but before I move on to the actual archaeology then, to tell you more about those stones, I just want to make the point that Govan, Kilpatrick, Kingarth, Inchmarnock, these places on the Firth of Clyde are amongst a very small number of churches that are named and discussed in early medieval sources. All right, not every church that existed gets a name check, but these that I've put on here, these do. And so Old Kilpatrick is right in the center of this Firth of Clyde cluster, and we know that these places are linked to each other by sea. Because of the letters of St. Patrick and the archaeology of imported pottery, those wine amphora, eWare, which is coming from France, also sort of congregates in this kind of area. And so these places are linked by the sea, not divided by the sea. Okay, and the best evidence for that, in an early Christian sense, comes from the Isle of Bute. So the monastery at Kingarth, if you've not gone down the water to Bute in a while, do take a trip to Kingarth. It's a beautiful ruin of a Romanesque church, but also lots of early medieval sculpture knocking about in their graveyard. A really great survival. Probably everything that you can see here dates back to the Middle Ages to a certain extent. It's a really fascinating place. We know the famous saint there was Saint Blaine, who is also culted at Strathblane and Dunblane. It seems to be a British person, but seems to have trained in Bangor in County Down, at least according to his later life story written down later in the Middle Ages. So again, like Patrick, a Briton in origin, but most famous perhaps for working in Ireland. But certainly this one is culted here more than anywhere else. Okay, so a British saint, but with that association with Ireland. And then subsequent churchmen are named from Kingarth. We've got a bishop called Daniel in the 7th century and an abbot called Noah in the 8th century. And it's been argued that these might be Irish people as well, because there's other people named Daniel, Noah, and other biblical names there. But I think these could as easily be Irish as Britons. But those links with Ireland are seen in the sculpture there as well, and none more clearly than in another monastery on the Isle of Bute. There's Inchmarnock. Very famous excavations written up in 2008 by Chris Lowe. Amongst other things, they found that there was a little school here at Inchmarnock. This monastery was not just a church with monks, it was a church that was training children how to write. It was teaching them how to write. And how did they do it? The same way that we did it for hundreds of years thereafter, writing with slate pencils on little slate boards. And so those slate boards preserve really well in the ground. And so we get chunks of them here. You can see all the doodles that definitely look like kids' drawings, but we also see words that we can understand and letters and the alphabet on one beautiful stone where there's the alphabet written very neatly and then the alphabet copied in a shaky, wobbly hand. It's the evidence of a teacher trying to teach a student. Here on this slate, we see this word, Ernan, written 3 times in an early medieval script. It can be dated to about the 7th century. This is the saint that goes down in history in this part of the world known as Saint Marnock. That means my Ernan or my little Ernan, M'Ernon, and then eventually M'Ernoch. Okay, in the British dialect. So Saint Marnock comes down to this name, Ernan. He seems to be another Irish saint, but again, culted in the Firth of Clyde area. You've heard of places like Dalmarnock and Kilmarnock, that's the same saint behind those names. Okay, so an Irish saint in this British area. So again, the sea is connecting people, and again, according to that writing, as early as the 7th century. What's great about the Inchmarnock? They're teaching people how to write in Latin. They're teaching them how to write in Ogham, another alphabet that is used in Ireland and also by the Picts. So this is a multilingual community there on the Isle of Bute. And I think that tells you everything about the Firth of Clyde, even in the so-called Dark Ages. But then things got really dark. So this is the Viking Age, I suppose. And in the 9th century, the Picts are on top of the heap. They're making great carvings of stone. This is an arch that is on display in the National Museum, which depicts a king of the Picts dressed up like a Roman. This great big stone arch would have been in a church. And so there has been at least one grand palatial Pictish church. I'm sure there were many more, but this is a really good survival. So it tells you about the 9th century. Yes, we're in the Dark Ages, but these people are wealthy and powerful. The kings of the Britons have their fortress on Dumbarton Rock. The kings of the Picts have their fortress at Burgh Head and many others. And this palace at Fort Teviot shows that they have imperial ambitions, you know. They are dressing like Romans. They are calling themselves grand names like Constantine, you know. So the Picts, the Britons, the Scots, they're really sort of at the top of their game. And this is what the map of Scotland looked like then. Dalriada, the Scots speaking Gaelic in the west, the Britons speaking the British language, cousin of Old Welsh, here in the southwest, the Anglo-Saxons in the southeast, and then the rest of Scotland dominated by the Picts. Then the Vikings come and things change irrevocably. So this is the map of the same area of Scotland, but by the 11th century. And I've taken this from a mapping site on the internet. So it's not completely accurate in detail, but it gives you a sense. The red places are places that have fallen victim to Vikings and are now controlled by the kings of Norway and occasionally the Viking kings of Dublin. Strathclyde is here where the Britons kingdom used to be, but then another breakaway kingdom is forming in Galloway, which would become more and more powerful. So the effect of the Vikings is basically to reduce the power of Dalriada. Dalriada kind of disappears, and to reduce the power of the Pictish kings. The Picts do, in fact, disappear by the year 900, and thereafter we get a nation called Alba. And we never hear about the Picts again. And so the effect of the Viking raids is to really reshuffle the board and effect regime change. And out of this mixture of things, we get the roots of what becomes Scotland, Ireland, and England. But before they form, we have this patchwork of little kingdoms: Galloway, Strathclyde, Alba, Northumbria, and the earldom of Orkney. Okay, so that's the main effect of the Vikings there. And we have from Inchmarnock this fantastic little image of that kind of Viking age in progress. If you've not been down to Bute again, go down to King Garth, but on your way there, pop by Rothley for the Bute Museum, and you can see this little bit from those excavations. Amongst the little slates where they're learning how to write, there's also this lovely drawing, and it seems to depict a Viking there in the center with his big sweeping hair, big bushy beard, quite angry maybe, wearing what looks like chainmail, and he's striding purposefully towards what looks for all the world like a Viking longship, which I'm sure is what it is. And he's leading somebody behind him who looks very different. He's not wearing chainmail. He's got a great big bushy beard, and he seems to have either a padlock or something chained to him. And at first it looks like somebody being led away as a prisoner, but that little house-shaped thing is probably one of these. It's a house-shaped reliquary. That one's called the Monimus Reliquary, also on display in the National Museum in Edinburgh. It's the only one of these surviving from Scotland, but every church of substance would have carried the relics of their patron saint in a little casket like this. We know that because there's lots surviving in Ireland and on the continent, but this is the only one that survives intact from Scotland.
Probably many of them were stolen in Viking raids, very similar to this one. Okay, and maybe this drawing is depicting either a child who is depicting a story that the child has heard, or maybe a scene that they've actually witnessed. Okay, so there's a great depiction of the Viking Age. And so we can play up that Viking side maybe a little bit too much because we know that by the 10th century, they, Norse speakers, have converted to Christianity or have begun to convert to Christianity. And it's places like the monastery at Inchmarnock where they're going to learn about God and Christ and everything else. So here's a cross slab, which looks like any other cross slab that you would find in the area in the 10th century, except this one's got great big runic inscription. And it names people with Scandinavian names. One of their names begins with Guth. This could be, it's been reconstructed as maybe Guthlifr or something similar to that, who raised this cross. And so in the 9th century, Viking raids, hassling monasteries, burning monasteries, killing monks. But a century later, the descendants of those early raiders are Christians and want to be buried in monasteries just like this. So it tells us a couple of things. Yes, the monasteries survived a lot of these attacks. They endured a lot of attacks, but they survived these attacks as well. The church does not disappear because of the Vikings in these areas. These areas don't seem to go pagan in many cases. A case could be made maybe for Orkney and Shetland, kind of backsliding for a bit, but churches survive there as well. Okay, this is the first clear evidence we have for a people called the Gall Gael. And you may have come across this term. It just means stranger Gaels. Gaul meaning foreigner or stranger, and Gael there meaning Gaelic speakers. So it means either Gaelic speakers who are Norse or Norse speakers who have begun to learn Gaelic. It's probably a bit of both. What we know about them is that in the 840s, in the Irish sources, we begin to get Irish people who are under attack, but also in this 847 record, you get these people, a large band of the Sons of Death who had been plundering the territories in the manner of the heathens. So there are Irish people who are starting to act a bit more like Vikings here. And in 856, we get the first mention, one of the first mentions of people called the Gall Gael. So these are people who are neither Vikings nor Irish. They are a bit of both. They're probably Scandinavians and Irish people who started to dress a certain way, who started to act a certain way, enough that they have to be given a new name, a hyphenated name, the Stranger Gaels. So this is one effect of the Viking Age. Some people sort of double down on Christianity. Some people might just go pagan, and some people kind of split the difference, and they begin acting in a completely new way. Okay, in 857, we begin to get notices of Viking people's names. Ivar and Olav inflicted a rout on the Gall Gael. So not only are we now starting to get Vikings referred to by name, so they are becoming famous, they are becoming more powerful, they are acting like Irish kings, perhaps, and they are also fighting other Vikings. These Vikings inflicted a rout on Kettle the Fair, another Viking, and his Gall Gael. All right. So they're fighting amongst themselves. So the Viking Age is a very messy time. Okay. It's not just Scandinavians against everybody else. It's a lot more complicated and a lot more fun to think about. Obviously, it was not fun to live through. It was very violent, but fun to think about now. And that's what the origin is of the Gall Gael. And it looks like one of the places that the Gall Gael were operating is in the Irish Sea Zone. And specifically, we get mentions of the Gall Gael later being on the Isle of Bute, in Ayrshire, on the Rins, and eventually in what's now called Galloway in the southwest of Scotland, which itself is just a later version. It's the land of the Gall Gael. Okay, so we know they're in this area. And then just to kind of cast the story forward, there at Inchmarnock, the Gall Gael kings are responsible for building the earliest churches that still survive there. So again, they've converted to Christianity. They've become church builders as well, certainly by the 11th and 12th centuries. So again, the Viking Age is stereotyped a lot, but we have no doubt that it was a Viking time. Okay, so let's just get finally then to the time period that we started with. Those two carved stones from Old Kilpatrick belong to the Viking Age. They're crosses, but they belong to the Viking Age. So here's how we get there. In 870, a very famous and audacious raid, Olav and Ivar, who we've just mentioned before, who were raiding away, some of the first Vikings to be named in the Irish sources, in 870, undertake what is the sort of raid of their life. They were able to besiege Dumbarton Rock for 4 months. And this isn't the time of castles and knights. Laying siege to a fortress is probably quite rare. You know, you're talking about pitched battles at set times, and defending a hill fort is one thing, but defending it for 4 months, God knows what they did for water, for sanitation, for food, but they did, and the Vikings held out. And their prize was that eventually they come back to Ireland with 200 ships, bringing with them in captivity a great prey of Angles and Britons and Picts. So they raid Dumbarton Rock and they bring back to Ireland boatloads of slaves, not just of Britons, but of everybody who was here and everybody who they raided on the way back to Dublin. Okay, so this was hugely audacious. It seems to spell the end of the fortress of Dumbarton Rock. After that point, it doesn't seem to be occupied until the Middle Ages later on. We have good archaeological evidence that the Vikings were there. We have these 2 lead weights. These are the kinds of weights that you use in little handheld balance scales in places like Dublin. And so these are probably made in Ireland. And then dropped here. Usually this means that there's trade going on. So maybe after they take the hill fort, they make it into a marketplace. They sell off the gold and silver and anything precious that can be got from there, and then the hill fort is abandoned. And what you're looking at there on the right is actually a part of a sword. The sword blade, the pommel, the tang of the sword hilt would go through this object. And so that's a bit of a Viking sword there. So again, good archaeological and historical evidence for the end of Dumbarton Rock there. This is an example of that kind of balance scale with little lead weights that we get in the Viking Age. This actually comes from a Viking burial on the Isle of Colonsay. Killearn Bay. And lead weights of various kinds are now popping up with metal detecting all over Northumberland as well. And so it's only a matter of time, I think, before we find more of these in the Firth of Clyde area. We know that part of the aftermath of that raid is that Vikings are granted some land or take some land. And very clearly, it looks like they've got an estate here on Luss, because there's hogback sculpture and this fascinating cemetery that was found in building the big golf course there near Mid-Ross. It was in a big enclosure, so it probably starts off as a Christian site, but many of the burials have grave goods, which is a very non-monastic thing to do at this time. And the kinds of grave goods they have, things like coins, like this one, perforated coins, worn as jewelry. That's the kind of thing that we get among the Viking Great Army and things like these. Okay, so very much a very interesting sort of result of that was that the land was settled to a certain extent by Vikings. Okay, we have other Viking burials from Cumbria and from southwest of Scotland. I don't really have any time to get into all this, but some of these are coming from churches as well as burial mounds. And so this is something that's happening across southwest Scotland and northwest England. At this time, it becomes a good way to get ahead is to learn a bit of Scandinavian, start acting a little bit like a Viking. All right. So not every one of these burials is necessarily somebody who was born in Scandinavia. And we get them from churches like Whithorn. These are all buckles which are probably worn by the dead there on Iona, but certainly worn by the dead at Oldham in East Lothian. So again, this is one of the things that Christians and pagans are both doing at this time. There's a lot of great work on the Viking Great Army. I can recommend these kinds of books, and there is a link of the raiding Viking Great Army of the 860s and the 870s with Strathclyde, because the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says in 874 and 875, Halfdan, one of the leaders of the Viking Great Army, begins to raid among the Picts and the Strathclyde Britons. So again, I think it's only a matter of time before we find something more like this in this area. One thing has been found in southwest Scotland. Another one of these perforated coins in a hoard dated to around 874. So this hoard, now on display in the National Museum, probably was buried around the time of that documented raids in the 874, 875 time period. But in our area, the closest we've got to some evidence of something like that, there is a coin hoard that's now lost, but it was recorded as being found in Paisley. And this almost certainly dates to the late 9th century. And so that's pretty good evidence, I think, for what's going on around the time of the Siege of Dumbarton. The only other hoard that we have from this area so far is from Port Glasgow, which was much later, sort of around the year 1000. Okay, but the Hunterston brooch in Ayrshire gives you a real sense of who was living in this area in the aftermath of all these Viking raids. This is an ancient object, a really deluxe object, gold and silver. It would have been worn only by kings and queens or bishops. But on the back of it, this is on display in the National Museum. On the back of this brooch, there's a signature, basically. It's been signed in runes. So a Viking has taken hold of this at some point. It's pinched it, maybe, or won it, or bought it. But what's interesting is that this particular Viking's name is Malbritha, which is a Gaelic name. It's a very common name in Scotland and in Ireland in the 10th and in the 11th centuries. So here we have a person who is probably dropping this in a hoard, so acting like a Viking, writing in Scandinavian runes, but who was called a Gaelic name. And that tells you about the Gaul Gael. That's who is in this area. Okay, that's the aftermath of those Viking raids. And this is probably the context of all those stones that we have at Strathclyde. So in the last few minutes here, because I want to leave some time for any questions that you might have, let's go into some more examples. I'll just skip through that. Let's just go through a couple of more examples just to put the stones from Old Kilpatrick in context, so you know that they're not alone and they're actually quite significant. The most famous example of sculpture is at Govan. If you haven't been to Govan, they're closed for the season, but if you ask them nicely, they might let you in. The Govan sarcophagus was probably made at the end of the 9th century. It's now thought that it was a tomb shrine to a king of the Picts called Constantine, who died at the hands of Vikings. And so he was martyred, and this was a martyr's shrine. So that probably explains that dedication to St. Constantine there. But it means that there's still a church here at Govan. We saw that this is one of the earliest churches, as far as we can tell by radiocarbon dated burials, and it continues to be important. In fact, it grows into a level of importance that it hadn't had before, because we know that alongside that sarcophagus, there's 5 hogback stones of massive size and 20 or 30 odd other crosses. And so this becomes a real royal burial place in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. And this happens even while the kingdom name changes from Alt Clut to Strathclyde to Cumbria, and eventually to becoming part of Scotland. this becomes and remains a very important place. And it's given its name to a school of sculpture. You see that chunky interlace, the very loopy interlace. That's the kind of decoration that you're also getting at Old Kilpatrick. And it's been called the Govan School of Sculpture. There's Govan in the middle of this map. And here's all the different examples of Govan School crosses all up and down the Clyde Valley. But this is kind of developed from a couple of stones around Glasgow and Paisley and the Firth of Clyde. It's become kind of a meme, so that almost any stone in the area becomes called the Govan School. There's a similar school of sculpture at Whithorn that develops around this time. So Govan is not alone here. The church, instead of sort of being destroyed by Vikings, is actually kind of booming at this time, and it's evidenced by these crosses. This is the distribution of the Whithorn School of Sculpture. Very different, but similar in some ways in the use of those ring knots and chunky interlace and free-armed crosses. And so the Whithorn School in the southwest of Scotland is parallel to what's going on in the Firth of Clyde with the Govan School. The Govan School is marked specifically by these hogbacks, famously because there's 5 of them there at Govan, but actually hogbacks are very rare outside of Govan in the Firth of Clyde area. The only other ones are way up the Clyde and Dalsurf, this kind of lonely one, and this beautiful one that looks more like the Govan ones from Luss. Other than that, there's no other hogbacks in the area, and they're actually more common in the east of Scotland, which is well outside of Strathclyde. And so I think the hogback thing is kind of overcooked. Govan is a very important collection of these, but I think the ones in the east of Scotland are quite different. And so I'm not going to dwell on, here's another one from East Lothian, which is just a beautiful one, which shares a lot of parallels with Romanesque sculpture. So these could go as late as the 12th century. But I'm not going to dwell on the hogbacks anymore, because the sculpture that we get in our area is a little different. So at Luss, where there's a Viking cemetery there at Midross, you have this great medieval font, this great medieval effigy, but then you also have these very simple cross-marked stones. And these date to the early medieval period. But then there's also a bunch of weirdos, like if you've ever been to Millport, the little museum on the beach there has these little crosses, and this bit of possibly a lintel is on display in Glasgow museums. And then there's truly weird things, like one that's currently in the church at Fairley near Largs. I don't even know what date to put on that. But more common are the ones that start to look a little bit more like the ones at Old Kilpatrick. These are some from Govan, Rossneath, and Inchinnan. These are cross slabs that are carved on both sides, standing upright. These are recumbent stones which laid over burials on the ground. Most of these are Govan, a very spectacular chunky one from Inchinnan, but most common are the freestanding crosses. And these are the ones that you have at Old Kilpatrick. There's great ones with riders and interlace from Butte to the Barracan Cross, which is in Paisley Abbey, Jordan Hill, which is in Govan Stones. And these very, very weird things from Hamilton, Carnwath, and Cardross, which sometimes get lumped into the Govan School. Mm-hmm. And then truly strange ones from Dumbarton Castle itself. Okay, so this is where your Old Kilpatrick stones are. These date to the Viking Age. These are 9th, 10th, and 11th century stones, and they tell you a little bit about the aftermath of those Viking raids. But they're quite rare, and again, to have 2 from one church like you have at Old Kilpatrick is very important and quite special, and these things should be a little bit better known. Okay, so I'll just leave it there. Thank you very much.